November 30th, 1939. 4 Soviet armies with 21 divisions, more than 400,000 soldiers, thousands of tanks, warplanes, and heavy artillery cross Finland's borders. The invasion is almost 3 times larger than the Allied landing at Normandy on D-Day. The Winter War is an intense and bloody conflict, fought in unimaginable extremes of cold. It will change the course of the Second World War and then be virtually forgotten. An invader with overwhelming military superiority, a defender with little more than the will to resist, and the unintended consequences of war. It is a history ignored by nations at their own peril. Finland is a nation forged from conflict. It was a struggle that attracted one young American to stake his life on a fight for freedom.
Never give up. Always fight for what is right.
300 years ago, Tsar Peter the Great founded a rival city just across the Gulf of Finland. St. Petersburg became the center of Russian Empire, and in 1917, the heart of a revolution. In 1924, it was renamed Leningrad to honor the first leader of the Soviet Union. Its population of 5 million is larger than the entire population of Finland. In 1939, Finland's border was only 40 kilometers away from Leningrad. Moving that border became a justification for war.
Comrades, soldiers of the Red Army, officers, commissars, and political workers, to fulfill the Soviet government's and our great fatherland's will, I hereby order the troops of Leningrad Military District to march over the frontier, crush the Finnish forces, and once and for all, secure the Soviet Union's northwestern borders and Lenin's city, the cradle of the revolution of the proletariat.
Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was confident of a quick victory. Most of his military agreed.
All we had to do was raise our voice a little bit and the Finns would obey. If that didn't work, we could fire one shot and the Finns would put up their hands and surrender. Or so we thought.
American Martha Gellhorn, one of the few international correspondents in Helsinki, witnessed the first bombers.
War started at 9 o'clock promptly. The people of Helsinki stood in the streets and listened to the painful rising and falling and always louder wail of the sirens. For the first time in history, they heard the sounds of bombs falling on their city. This is the modern way of declaring war.
The Red Army advanced quickly on all fronts. Finland's defenses seemed on the verge of collapse.
Their use of mass formations of tanks initially had a shattering effect on the Finns. They had never confronted a tank in training, and suddenly...
The main thrust of the Russian offensive was through a narrow strip of land between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland, called the Karelian Isthmus.
We didn't believe it.
Eva and her family were among the thousands of Karelians evacuated by the Finnish army. Their homes and barns were burned, food and livestock removed or destroyed to prevent their use by the enemy.
We were very much afraid of being taken to Siberia. Every child knew that Siberia was a threat if we lose the fight. And that was a terrible feeling.
But for Eva, the war truly came home the day her father was called away. The Soviet invasion was planned as an overwhelming onslaught everywhere at once. President Franklin Roosevelt condemned the attack.
It has invaded a neighbor so infinitesimally small that it could do no conceivable possible harm to the Soviet Union. A small nation that seeks only to live at peace as a democracy, and a liberal, forward-looking democracy at that.
A widespread shortage of ammunition made the situation more grave for the outgunned Finns.
What do you do in a small country where there isn't very much ammunition? You use knives. And already in the Finnish history there has been puukko. And puukko was used for a lot of things, and now it became very handy as a defense mechanism. Because believe me, when you get that under your ribs, it doesn't feel good.
In an often unforgiving climate, Finns fell back to the survival skills they learned as children. It was part of a character quality summed up in the word sisu.
It means that personal kind of ability or spirit that every Finn is supposed to have, that when things go wrong, you don't give up.
In August of 1939, the balance of power in Europe suddenly shifted. Communist Russia and Nazi Germany, mortal ideological enemies, suddenly became allies.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was the key that really made the war possible, because it gave Stalin a free hand in those parts of Europe that the treaty allowed him to move into.
On September 1st, Germany invaded Poland from the west, utilizing a new form of warfare called blitzkrieg. On September 17th, Soviet troops launched a similar attack from the east. The two armies met at the Bug River. In October, the Soviets demanded and gained concessions for military bases in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Finland's turn came last.
They could see that this was not just a war to change the borders a couple of kilometers. This was a total war where Stalin intended to occupy and dominate Finland.
The Finns refused to accept our conditions, so we were left with no choice but to decide the question by war.
On November 28th, the Soviet Union broke off diplomatic relations. On November 30th, Soviet troops crossed Finland's borders. Finland's entire army, a total of 300,000 soldiers, including reserves, faced the world's largest army of more than 2 million soldiers, with many millions more in reserve. The first week of fighting demonstrated the power of Soviet armor. Finnish troops were pushed back. Shock and fear accompanied retreat and defeat. They searched for a way to beat back Soviet armor.
Our platoon leader informed us we were about to receive secret weapons that could blow up and burn any enemy tank. It did not take long until the promise was fulfilled.
The Molotov cocktail is probably the most famous poor man's weapon system of the 20th century, and it was named after Stalin's foreign minister, Molotov. If you got up behind the tank and dropped a bottle of flaming gasoline into those air ducts, the flaming gasoline would get sucked into the engine, the tank's fuel would blow up, and for the price of a half a gallon of gas, you could destroy an enemy tank.
Toinen oli sitten nämä kasapanokset, ja siinä oli oltava vielä lähempänä, koska se ei ollut sitä pystynyt heittämään oikeastaan paljon 10-15 metriä pitemmän matkaa, että se oli sitten se toinen hurja torjuntakeino. Ja kolmas,
There was one ski trooper who was decorated for actually immobilizing a Russian tank with a crowbar. He pried the treads off. There was one ski trooper who was decorated for actually immobilizing a Russian tank with a crowbar. He pried the treads off by brute force, whereupon his partner came out with a satchel charge and blew it up.
This is a place where the Soviet troops get across Taipolin River and established a bridgehead. When the Soviet engineers established the pontoon bridge, the many casualties were because of Finnish fires. So this bank was full of Soviet engineers' bodies.
Kirill Yakimovich is an engineer from St. Petersburg. He has crossed this river and walked this ground since childhood. He has looked beneath the surface and studied it carefully. Gradually, he learned its awful secrets.
I suppose that the Soviet 105th Rifle Division occupied these dugouts. There are plenty of them here. Dugouts, foxholes, which Soviet soldiers excavated.
They attacked across this open field. It began on December 6th.
They were frontal assaults over and over and over again against the same heavily defended Finnish lines. Entire battalions were wiped out.
By December 17th, 3 Russian divisions had failed to breach Finnish defenses at Taipale.
The Russians went in principally for mass attack, which resulted in the attackers being mown down to the last man by a few well-placed automatic weapons. In spite of this, one attacking wave after another would follow with a similar result.
In some cases, the second, third, fourth wave attacks were actually able to get closer to Finnish lines by taking cover behind their own dead. The temperature was so low that after an hour, a corpse would stop a bullet just as well as a brick wall.
The carnage was too much for some defenders.
There were instances where, for instance, Finnish machine gunners became psychologically unstable because they were called upon to commit this absolutely mindless slaughter day after day after day. They may have hated the Russians for invading their country, but these were not automatons. These were human beings with wives and children, and they were being called to murder hundreds of men a day.
On December 17th, the Soviet offensive shifted to the most strategically important and the most vulnerable sectors of the Mannerheim Line, Suma and Ladi. A breakthrough here would open a gate to the city of Viborg.
One flamethrower tank started to throw flames into the trench at Harkkila strongpoint. Fire from Millionaire bunker and from our infantry prevented the enemy's infantry from getting into our trenches. 2 machine guns fired a total of 40,000 rounds.
Our men held out bitterly in their trenches. There was no panic. Many silent dead littered the ground in front of our positions.
Ja urhoollisia taistelijoita nämä olivat puna-armeijan miehet. Ei siinä mitään, vaikka meidän tulitimme niin paljon kuin pystyimme suomalaisilla konekivääreillä, pikakivääreillä ja kivääreillä, niin juoksivat siinä niin, että piikkilanka-aidoille tulivat ja juoksivat sitten vielä toistensa yli, jotka kuolivat siihen.
The tanks stopped, took casualties, and started to withdraw. This completely demoralized our infantry. The division did not have any success during the day of December 17th, 1939, and after darkness, infantry was withdrawn, having suffered heavy losses.
The battle was stressful, both physically and psychologically. In spite of a whole day of heavy fighting, we were not depressed. The fact that we held on gave us confidence.
That confidence was tested each morning of an unrelenting Soviet offensive.
The enemy's artillery barrage in the morning of December 19th grew to an overwhelming thunder and hit the main defensive line in Summa village the hardest. Our platoon leader gave me responsibility for dealing with the tanks approaching us on the highway. There were no signs of life inside the tank. With our small contribution to the fighting on this day, the hardest of the hardest days was over.
But even harder days would follow.
Tanks again broke through. In the evening, we counterattacked.
Despite all our shortages in equipment, we did the enemy a lot of harm. There were men in our platoon for whom the destruction of tanks was just a regular day's work.
December 21st, 1939. It was Stalin's 60th birthday. His generals had promised Finland as a gift. Instead, they sent back trainloads of dead and wounded, and more bad news from the battlefront.
I saw a field and our dead men lying like heaps of grass during harvest. The next day we did not attack. Our losses were too high and the assault was cancelled.
The offensive against Suma and Taipale during the month of December had decimated 7 Soviet infantry divisions. The remains of 250 tanks littered the battlefield. It was a stunning defensive victory for Finland. Mid-December, winter deepened. Temperatures descended. The winter of 1939 was one of the coldest in recorded history, with temperatures consistently below zero. Temperatures of -40 and 50 Celsius were not uncommon. He witnessed Finnish ski commandos with a more lethal form of expression. Hasey describes their handiwork in his memoir. It has become a legend of the Winter War. In January, sporadic fighting continued on all fronts, but after 1 full month of war, major operations by the Red Army ceased.
January was largely a lull. Both sides were regrouping. It was a time of taking stock.
The enemy's attacks in December could be compared with a badly conducted orchestra, in which the instruments were played out of time. Division after division was thrown against our positions, but the cooperation between the different arms remained bad.
In the 1930s, Stalin conducted a campaign of terror against perceived enemies of the state. It would consume the professional officer corps of the Red Army. Thousands of officers were arrested and executed, including 90% of its generals and 80% of its colonels. They were replaced with less experienced soldiers, along with a cadre of political officers. But real power was in the hands of the NKVD, a secret internal security force that reported directly to Stalin himself.
They interfered with everything, and they had the right and the authority to go in anywhere and to take very drastic measures like shooting the general, shooting anyone.
Soviet state military archives document the fate of the 76th Tank Battalion, 34th Light Tank Brigade, trapped within a moti at Lemete. In January of 1940, Battalion Commander Captain Ryazanov began to plan a breakout. But the battalion's NKVD officer opposed it. He called Ryazanov a coward. Ryazanov replied, "I am in charge. I give the orders." Only 19 men of that battalion survived the war.
For Stalin, this situation was desperate because he was worried about Hitler, even despite the treaty. He had to somehow knock the Finns out of the war.
Stalin brings in General Timoshenko, who was one of the few really good professional Red Army soldiers who had escaped the purges.
Timoshenko augmented his forces for a massive new offensive with 45 divisions, 750,000 soldiers, more than 3,000 artillery pieces, 2,000 tanks, and hundreds of fighters and bombers.
And he adjusted the strategy. Now he concentrated all the forces against the key to Finland, which was in southern Finland, the Karelian Isthmus.
Field Marshal Mannerheim monitored the Soviet buildup and understood the inevitable. As he committed the last of his reserves, Mannerheim drew confidence from the fundamental strength of his nation.
The nation stood as one man behind their armed forces in the calm and determined knowledge that the struggle must go on.
On February 1st, the Soviets resumed their offensive. Up to 2,000 artillery shells hit the Mannerheim line each day for the next 10 days. On February 11th, up to 250,000 shells rained down on the line. It was the largest artillery barrage since the Battle of Verdun during the First World War.
8:35, an unprecedented artillery bombardment of our entire sector. 12:15, tanks have broken through. Enemy infantry has captured part of our positions.
All Finnish reserves were thrown into battle. The Red Army could not be contained.
By the end of February 13th, on the third day of the offensive, the 123rd Rifle Division with attached armor units broke through the main defensive line. Suma fortified area was completely destroyed.
At the end of February, Jack Hazy's work as an ambulance driver came to a sudden end. The next day, he was evacuated from the front line. At the end of February, Finnish defenders had been pushed back to a line in front of the strategic city of Viborg, headquarters for the Finnish forces on the Karelian Isthmus. Finnish defenders struggled to hold the line in front of Viborg. On March 5th, Soviet troops attempted a flanking maneuver across the frozen Gulf of Finland to surround the city of Viborg. When Finns detected columns of tanks and infantry on the ice, they fired their huge coastal batteries, 12-inch guns, intended to sink battleships.
The weight and velocity of the projectiles was so enormous that it shattered the Gulf ice and opened up yawning gaps, and whole Russian companies disappeared through these holes in the ice.
The Finns' desperate resistance continued with a ferocity that masked a steadily diminishing capacity. By March 12th, they had almost no more ammunition. At noon on March 13th, the word spread along the line. An armistice had been signed. The brutal 105-day war was over.
If a fly had been in the air, he would have heard its buzz. Not a single shot. Dead silence. I did not believe such a thing was possible. Then, people started to regain their senses. Started throwing hats and all kinds of stuff in the air. Almost nothing remained of our battalion. Front line is front line. All I felt was indifference. What do I remember most from that war? It was the incompetence of our army. It could not even deal with a handful of Finns. They showed us how to fight a war.
Gunnar Latio, leading a column back toward Finland's newly negotiated border, decided to stop to check on his men.
Our company commander told us, the war is over. After that, he met a Finnish company commander in no man's land. In the evening, everyone started campfires. Our campfires were far from the Finnish ones.
Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been a re-examination of this cataclysmic conflict.
Too much on technology. Technology is important, material strength is important, but skill, how you use your equipment is even more important, and ultimately will. If you don't have the will to fight, nothing else matters.
The people of Finland have shown that a united nation, small though it may be, can develop unprecedented fighting power and thus withstand the most formidable ordeals that destiny brings. By closing ranks at the moment of peril, the people of Finland earned for themselves the right to continue to live their own independent lives within the family of free peoples.
Finland won. Because had Finland lost, she would have been occupied by the Soviets and she would have been like Estonia, which actually gave way to Stalin's demands and was occupied. And so in this sense, Finland won, obviously.